Let's record. Let's go. Let's go. Let's go. All right. Welcome, everybody. Welcome particularly to those of you who are new, and welcome back, all of those of you who've seen me talk before. Can you hear me okay? Yeah, good, good. Um, okay, cool. So last week, there were a few Slido questions that I didn't get to. I think they might have come in late, or we didn't see them, or something like that. So I am gonna have a look at those. I think what I might do is I'll sort of quickly respond to them a little bit at the beginning to make sure I don't miss them. And then I will do the thing that I said I would do last week, which was to talk about what's it? Why AI researchers kind of lost control of AI research, why that might have happened. And that also touches on a couple of ideas that I've talked about in previous talks. They'll give you a sense of like maybe strategically, it's not going to help you very much unless you're really ambitious and want to set up your own foundation AI research group, but it might tell you like who might be good to bet on and why they might be doing well, and hopefully some of it will be useful. Okay, so let's answer some of the questions. So the first question is, will AI take our jobs? Okay, that's a tricky question to answer. Okay, so when AI first appeared, when ChatGPT first appeared, quite a number of people asked me this question. Some of the people who asked me this question were retired, so they were more concerned about the economy falling apart and war and various other things. So what I did, which was really fun, was I contacted expert economists, and some of them got back to me, and I had meetings with some of them to have a conversation about this. And I did what I could to sort of try to find who was the world expert on this, what they published on it, and stuff like that. So in general, obviously, it's a very new phenomena in the sense of this particular AI revolution, but people have talked about automation taking people's jobs and like leading to social unrest many, many, many times throughout history, right? It's so common, in fact, that economists have a completely standard answer for this. And their standard answer is it has never led to mass unemployment. So you might have a specific job in a specific industry, like I don't know, is the term stevedores or something? I can't remember, but they're people who used to take stuff on and off ships. And that task of taking stuff on and off ships onto like trucks and things, that was a major employer for a long period of time. And then what happened was this guy basically cornered the market. I don't think he did it worldwide, but he did it somewhere on that kind of infrastructure. And he basically caused the creation of the shipping crate. And because they standard on shipping crates, and then they could create cranes and eventually automated services so that the transportation at the resolution of shipping crates became almost totally automated. And now there's very few people in the world who are paid to take things on and off ships because it's almost completely done. And it's fascinating how automated it is. There's actually like people are trying to create, maybe already do have, in fact, self-driving container ships. And one of the things that you probably don't realize is that it's not just like computer chips and things that have got better. The bandwidth of international shipping is just continuing to increase. The cost of shipping things has gone down enormously, and it's a fascinating world that we've built. So basically, when I talked to these economists, when I read the papers that some not very many people had talked about the recent case, but they would just say in a smug way, they would just say like it's never happened. People have worried about it over and over and over again, and it's never happened. Every single time there is a technological advance, a whole new set of jobs become available, and Therefore, they are certain that this will happen again. And you can understand from an empirical standpoint, you can make these newspaper articles going back a very long time, talking about everything, talking about cars, talking about factories, talking about all kinds of different technological events and the disruption that it would cause. So the argument that people are making now is to say, this is not the same as all of the other ones. Why is this not the same? Well, because what was actually trying to be built first is AGI, and different people mean different things, but broadly the way that word is starting to, or that phrase is starting to be associated with, is able to do all useful economic work at least as well as a human. Now, in practice, when people talk about AGI, they almost exclusively mean digital work. So anything that doesn't require physically changing the world in some way. And obviously, all the bets on humanoid robots are effectively saying, well, that will be next. We'll do the physical stuff a little bit later, but it'll come along very quickly. And in that situation where an AI can do every task in the entire economic chain, the question then is, what's the relative cost of humans versus machines? So another thing that people often point out is that in the case of robots, we've had robots for a very long time to automate manufacturing. But actually, a tiny percentage of manufacturing, at least until relatively recently, has been done by humans, often in China or in other places where labor is cheaper. And we just don't see it very much in the Western world because we don't have very many factories that operate that way. And so they were sort of saying, well, you underestimate how expensive it is to create a reliable automated system that can do a task. So when you look at self-driving cars, you sort of say, well, that's sort of true, right? Self-driving cars are sort of an illusion. Most self-driving car companies actually have humans sitting remotely, watching screens, ready to intervene to drive them. They absolutely do not handle all the corner cases involved in driving. Part of that might be because we're not ready to accept the reality of driving. And that might be true in lots of jobs. So often when you automate something or you formalize something, you're in this strange situation. Lawyers sometimes get involved. People start telling you how the job should be done and things like that. And driving cars is a very good example. Driving cars is extremely deadly. Loads and loads of people die and have terrible things happen to them. So like, it's a really big deal allowing that to happen autonomously. The problem is if you literally follow the rules of the road, you may never be able to pull out into traffic because none of the other people are following the rules. And so actually there are lots of situations in which you have to be quite aggressive in order to resolve like a junction or something like that, right? And so you've got this disconnect between what if somebody was like formally or legally judging whether the car was doing the thing it's supposed to do, it would say it's not doing the thing it's supposed to do. You also have things, you just have people. I saw a Reddit video recently where this lady had, for some reason, decided to dry fruit in the middle of the road by laying out all this fruit on the road. And this self-driving car had come down the road. And so she was just standing in front of it, preventing it from moving while her fruit dried. It seemed really bizarre, but she didn't seem like the kind of person that was like making fake YouTube videos. So God knows what was going on there. But there are obviously plenty of human beings who will treat robots in a way that they would never treat a human being. And it would very quickly escalate to like some kind of criminal antisocial behavior problem and you know, which doesn't apply to robots. Robots don't have any rights. So in practice, it can be very difficult to do that. Also, when we look at what is actually happening and the technology and what's being used, there is a gap, right? All the rhetoric is saying, you know, these AIs are like PhD level intelligences. They can do all these amazing things. But when they're actually put down and used by an expert, a lot of problems appear, very like the driving case. So, like, we don't really know how bad it is, how likely it is to have like very high levels of automation. Now, of course, if you look at something like AI art, you're seeing very rapid progress. You're also seeing very rapid progress in a weird kind of S-curvy way, right? Which in previous talks, I talked about the fact that technology tends to follow this kind of S-curve of adoption and S-curve of technological benefit, right? So, before the iPhone, you have this period where everything's really experimental and doesn't really work, and only like super early adopters who are willing to use something that's actually a burden ever use it. It passes a point of being usable, and then very quickly, lots of people take it up, and it sort of influences the world a great deal. And then you have this long leveling off, which is kind of the past 10 years of smartphones, where it's hard to really tell. Like, unless you really care about having a certain number of pixels in your camera, you're probably not going to notice the difference between the devices. So this kind of this kind of situation, I would argue, is happening in AI art. So AI art to me is further on than large language models. It happened earlier. You can train it faster and with lower resources. You can run it with lower resources than the large language models. So what we're seeing with AI art is, very good improvement in performance, and then quickly transitioning to video. So video is kind of the new AI art, and OpenAI released it, Sora 2, yesterday. So you get to see what the latest version is like. But what's interesting is they didn't really solve all the older problems. So if you know what you're doing and you're like a professional or something, and you're trying to use these tools, you'll find that they are better, but still far from perfect. So if you wanted to do something like make a professional logo or graphic design something, it's getting better, but it's a bit like the self-driving car. It's still not quite there yet. So what we're seeing is dramatic things, but they're sort of changing the nature of the problem as we see them appear. So what's probably going to happen is video length will exceed until we get to like movie length, but the movies will still have some kind of like problem with them. And then before that, those problems start to be fixed properly, we'll probably get interactive, like virtual worlds or something next. So what we're seeing is that actually long tails are really hard, and long tails are really important when it comes to work, because the people who buy stuff are managers. They do not want, one of the benefits of having a human being is you can blame them. And human beings can accommodate a lot of problems. So in a lot of organizations, when you want to do something, you can have an incompetent manager, but a competent and experienced employee who will like fix the fact the manager is incompetent. And I would say that's surprisingly common. But it's not entirely their fault. It's usually the case that the person who's doing the actual work gets a lot more feedback about whether they're doing the right thing or not, potentially, than the manager. So if you were to swap that human for a machine, you would lose a lot of that generality, common sense knowledge, experience of doing the task that was covering up for directions that sort of didn't make sense. So employees often like cover the ass of their boss by basically anticipating problems their boss hasn't thought about. If you transition to an automated solution, at least at the moment, the AI is probably going to do what the boss tells them to do, which means the boss is now considerably more at risk and responsible for the outcome of the result. So whether or not that will work en masse in lots of organizations, it's not clear that that will actually work. What might work is very competent people with a more entrepreneurial mindset using a lot of AIs, and then the good decision making is in the hands of a small number of competent and energetic people, and then those people are massively empowered because they control a sort of slave caste of AIs, right? So that is, people have talked about that. They've talked about like the first one-man billion-dollar company and things like that. And I think OpenAI has set that as a target or something for their company to try to bring that about. But so, you know, the reality when you look at things is that they're often messy. The question is, given all of that reality, um, do I still think the situation is probably the same as the past? Or is there something special about this situation? So for me, there is one critical task that if it was heavily automated, it would change the game for everything. And that is the task that a huge amount of money and energy is being poured into. And that is the task of automating AI companies. So if the task of fixing the long tail of corner cases and problems and all of this stuff, if that could somehow be automated and effectively a company that has the most money, the most server farm, the most compute can basically start polishing and making usable technology very, very rapidly in an automated way, then that is obviously going to bridge this gap that has historically always been filled by human beings. And so you would get these amazing AI entrepreneurs that would basically recognize all these problems. They would superhumanly talk to people, understand what they wanted, create exactly solutions for them. They would like manage them when they were deployed in an organization. They would make sure they'd learned as much as possible. They would fix any problems that arose, as very skilled people do in any industry. So if that task, that general task, could be automated, and it probably would still have humans behind the scenes handling the corner cases and refining it, but there's a kind of recursive self-improvement there because, you know, how it works can also be automated by itself. So if we see any indication of that, to me, that is the beginning of the end. That's a very dramatic way of putting it, but the beginning of like a completely unrecognizable change to the world. Because now we're really in a situation where humans are largely redundant. Any task the awareness of problems in the world, convincing other people to let you change them, changing them and altering the world is all automated and superhumanly capable. People would cease to pay anyone for anything because the AIs would always be the best solution. That, you know, how would we actually live in a world like that, right? So at the moment, AI companies are mostly what they do is program and run experiments. Anthropic are at the moment technically the leader in doing this, although OpenAI are really close and Gemini is coming along very closely behind. Uh, Anthropic publicly state that a very large percentage of all of their programming work is done by AIs now, and that they believe that they are speeding up and it's helping them, right? And but that's still not anywhere near what I'm talking about, which involves dealing with tricky corner cases and problems, like not just the easy stuff, right? In any kind of situation, there's all this what's often called low-hanging fruit. You just try to solve that stuff, and then that stuff's kind of easy, but then it's the weird edge cases that get you every time. So at the moment, nobody, for example, has released an open source project that if you run it, will basically create a better AI art, architecture or something like that, the kind of things that the foundation models are producing. So we don't quite have recursive self-improvement yet. So, okay, that was a really long answer to that question. And if I keep answering questions like that, then we'll be here all week. So let me answer a few more questions faster. Could you talk about how AI might change medicine? So that again is a potentially long conversation. I did talk about that a little bit in the past where I was skeptical of medicine improving quickly because of the human organizational problems associated with that. And just the way that healthcare is run as an industry. Most industries don't change or improve significantly over time. the one that I'm in, for example, lecturing, teaching, doing research, it has not significantly improved over time, except for the little story that I will tell you in a moment. So yeah, I think that medicine is probably a little bit further off. All of the rich, powerful people in the world, I don't know if anyone caught this little nugget of news, but recently Putin and a number of different world leaders that are not allied with the West very strongly were chatting to each other, and they were caught on a hot mic, and Putin was basically talking about longevity research, basically. And so every major player, anyone with any money approaching retirement age, this is something that they bring up all the time in these VC conversations. So there is a huge amount of money and power like focused on AI for medicine and biology. It's very serious. It's definitely progressing, but there is this at the moment like a big gap between that initial embryonic research work and anything like the iPhone for healthcare. Basically, we're not there yet. But massive investment in that, all kinds of crazy things, to some extent antibiotics, which for many years of my life, everyone was saying, oh no, we'll never find any more antibiotics. We can't come out with them. Now we've got AIs, we've got all kinds of new ways to kill bacteria. So yeah, it's definitely something is happening, but it's well away from the other things. How can we secure a job in the AI field? What new developments in AI should we focus on soon? Okay, so depends what you mean by an AI job. There are different kinds of AI jobs. If you want to have a job at like a frontier AI research company or a startup AI research company, it's very likely that you will need a PhD in artificial intelligence from one of the top universities. By top, Queen's sort of counts. I don't know. I did my PhD in Southampton, which is not like massively more prestigious than Queen's, but it's a little bit more connected. Some of the English universities are a little bit more connected with each other. And the other two people that I was kind of friendly with when I was doing my PhD, they basically went off and did that. So one person's working for Apple, another person worked for a number of places. I think I said OpenAI, but I think it was DeepMind they actually had their job at, but they're working at a startup now. And both of them did like a solid PhD in, this was obviously in computer vision mostly, before it was cool, I suppose. So they've been in AI a little bit longer, and maybe that helps. But that's the traditional route if you want to get into those kinds of organizations. The other kind of AI job you might have is like working for Kainos. So Kainos, for example, and they may be doing something differently now, but when I kind of knew what they were doing, mostly they would use AI as a sales tool. So most of their work is with government agencies. So they had a group that would do like cutting edge technology, and then they would sort of show that off to potential government departments, and that would cause them to like do a more conventional software project with Kainos. So that's a much more feasible kind of programming gig to get, because it's really more part of the ecosystem of being employed in a large company. And that kind of work, you basically want to do some more traditional teach yourself AI kind of tasks. Early on, Liam gave a little talk, who's someone I work very closely with, a former student, and he what I got him to do was just whatever the most advanced AI was at the time, just try to get it running and try to understand it. And that kind of behavior where you're skipping to the state of the art and sort of trying to learn about that, even if nothing works, nothing runs or whatever, that will typically impress people quite a lot and help you get in the door. So yeah, those are the kind of main like sources of employment. The other thing that you can be involved in is what Liam does and what I do to a certain extent, which is sort of contract work. And a lot of that is about talking to people who know about AI, think they need AI, but aren't sure why. And so a lot of it is just sort of talking to people and explaining AI to people in a more mundane way. Can be as banal as just like, this is ChatGPT. Let's type something into ChatGPT. Look, see what it does, right? That kind of level of basic. And then sometimes it's more complicated than that. But AI for many years, which will come into the story I'll tell in a moment, was actually not a practical tool to solve problems. Almost all software work is business to business SaaS companies, which I may have talked about before. So what that is you're selling to a manager because managers control what projects get run and what budgets are available. And what you're doing in that situation is the manager's problems are almost always about managing people. And so you build like a web front end, database back end bit of software that turns their working practices into a kind of ritual. And by doing that, it's so much easier to manage people because basically a person can't complete their job or can't progress to the next stage of their job without interacting with the website. And the website will simply not allow them to do things in a way the manager doesn't want to happen. If you don't have that, if you have paper forms and things like that, managers have to run around constantly monitoring what everyone is doing and trying to encourage them to do things. And if they don't do them in the way they want done, then effectively things will slide into a path of easier life, basically, which is typically not what the manager is trying to achieve. So effectively, once you have these SaaS products, to some extent, the manager's job can be quite easy to some extent because they'll have a dashboard and they'll see how everything's doing. They can sort of surveil their employees in a way they couldn't before. And this is kind of the reality of it. And you get the same thing with like front ends for consumers or things like that. The human version is to have a shop with a human being in it. If you have a website, then it's a lot more efficient. You can get a lot more work from people and stuff like that if you sort of automate the front end. Okay, so right. Now I need to get back to what I was talking about. Yes, so how the problem with AI is AI tends to automate tasks, and generally speaking, all tasks have these corner cases that don't work. So it's been practically easier and economically cheaper to just force people to follow an online interface ritual, which has no intelligence to it at all, than to try to accommodate flexibility in how people interact with what you're doing. And generally, flexibility, I always remember the Kinect on Xbox, which you may be too young to have familiarity with. But when it came out, it was this idea that it was going to revolutionize computer games because you could just like naturally interact with something by moving around in front of your TV. Aside from the fact that it was tiring to do that, it was also inaccurate. And it turns out if you have an interface that isn't completely predictable, like really high levels of reliability, one failure in 1,000 is even probably too much, then psychologically you feel really differently about that interface. And so it's much better to have like sort of old Second World War planes with like weird, dials and things, and the human being adapts to this very predictable behavior that they have to sort of learn, than to have a situation where it's like Star Trek and you're just saying like, I'll go that way, please. And then like one time in 1,000, it doesn't do it. And then your plane gets blown up, right? So effectively, super high levels of reliability are typically required in the workplace for different tasks. And only humans currently deliver that in a way that is affordable, except in really specialized circumstances like a conveyor belt factory where everything is controlled and the only thing the AI is doing is some very specific task like recognizing that potatoes are the wrong color and kicking them out of the conveyor belt or something like that. So almost all commercial AI work was actually in very, very niche circumstances. Almost everything else was people, and the big killer app was like human organization. So we haven't seen that transition yet. Management consultancy companies are trying to sell AI. AI companies are trying to suggest that AI would be fixed in this way. But actually, all the business of AI is about augmenting, like assisting people with their jobs. So it's easier to write an email, it's easier to program a computer, but you're not actually automating the person away. You're just making it faster and easier for them to do their job. Sometimes by like multiples of the amount of work they could do. So what companies are sort of doing is that they're not replacing whole units of their business with automated things like they might do if they bought some kind of like part of a factory and they replaced it with a machine and they fired everybody associated with the task. What they're mostly doing is making teams smaller and having more experienced people in the teams use AI. So that's basically what they're doing, but they're not completely replacing them. So it's effectively a multiplier on things. That's still enough to severely reduce the number of people who are being hired in entry-level positions in different places. So yeah, it's still a risk. What should you focus on to remain relevant? Well, what I would say is I am putting half of my chips. So basically, I spend my time recruiting clever people and doing various things to acquire resources so I can run a lot of projects. And about half of all the people who do work for me, I am allocating to one specific area, and that is the automation of AI IDEs for programming. And I think that that is the first example of what we will see more generally. So an AI IDE, where an AI programs a computer, is effectively an AI that builds a large thing from a lot of little changes to something that is somewhat formally described. Now, in this case, it's computer code, but in theory, that would apply to lots of jobs. So if you're a lawyer and you're building a big legal case or something, I'm arguing that the same kind of technology would be applicable in that situation. So I think that mastering the use of AI IDEs, understanding how they work and how they're improving, and experimenting with them to apply to whatever you're thinking of going into as a career is probably your best use of resources. There's plenty of employers that'll say weird things, that they don't like AI IDs, they don't like AI programming, all kinds of stuff. To me, that's all just noise. And it's just like, this is the thing that is the most accelerating tool in the world. And so mastering this, mastering how to do larger projects with less work is kind of the direction that I would go in. Okay, I heard that robotics is the future. Could you elaborate on that? There are two camps here. I've seen the same thing happen in AI, where the people who used to be good at AI before the new technology arrived all say, oh, the new technology is like stupid. And like they just don't know what they're doing. They'll never sell anything. We've tried that, it doesn't work. All these kind of phrases. This is a very familiar thing whenever there's a big change. The argument is that the marketplace for robotics up until recently has largely been factories. It's been the same environment that the marketplace for AI has been. So it's very controlled circumstances, very repeatable operations, all these kinds of things. The premise of what everyone's doing at the moment feels a little bit like VR. It's kind of like this is a very exciting future idea. The argument goes something like the world is built for humans. If you create a robotic human, you don't have to adapt the world at all. And therefore, if you've got a robot that was kind of approaching human levels of dexterity and control, then you could just seamlessly swap humans for robots. And because every robot is the same, then you can mass produce them. And so the cost of them would plunge. And so I would say that robots haven't had their iPhone moment yet, basically. That, you know, the biggest, other than industrial robots, the biggest robots are basically the ones that vacuum your carpet. That's like the killer app, plus some toys, but even toys haven't been that successful. So we're seeing all these really exciting videos, but we've not seen any demonstration where somebody says, that's cheaper than a human, that's better than a human. All the cases that are like that are things like Amazon Robotics, Ocado, which is associated with another supermarket firm, Waitrose, And they have all these robot systems, but they look nothing like humans. Everything's very custom. It's very like a factory. We've got lots of robots for shipping crates, but we don't have a general purpose robot. A self-driving car is the closest thing that we have. Even then, that is not clearly profitable. So it's a gamble. It's a gamble that Elon Musk is making. He has tied his like becoming the richest man in the world again to this. So a lot of resources, a lot of money, a lot of credible skill is being directed in this direction, but we haven't seen evidence that it will actually work. It could be like VR, where like VR was achieved and everyone was like, do you know what I mean? It's just not actually as good as you thought it would be, or something like that. And humanoid robots might be similar. It might be like still too pricey. Their dexterity isn't very good. Do you know what I mean? They're like a gimmick, effectively. Um, what's interesting is with previous technological innovations, they start as a toy or a form of entertainment. So, like a lot of things, drones, 3D printers, all kinds of things. Well, 3D printers actually had industrial uses before they were hobby devices. But you know, that early adopter window is sort of like the fun and gimmickry of it. So I'm expecting to see that first. So people will like, in the same way that in the early days of the dot-com era, people made websites but had no idea why. So Coca-Cola made a website and they were like, why are we making a website? It's like, I don't know. I don't know how it works. Nobody, you know, the only people online are it's a very small number of nerdy people who have dial-up internet and stuff like that. So, you know, why are we doing this? We don't know. And they do the same with the robots. It would be sitting in like you'd walk down the shops and somebody would have a robot and it'd be like saying hello when you came into the door or something like this, but it would be practically useless otherwise. Or people could work out some form of like game or something that you could play with the robot. Um, so we haven't hit that. So we're far away from that. And really, you need that sort of crazy recursive self-improvement loop to believe that technology that's that far away would suddenly become useful quickly, if that makes sense. Cool. And then as a question about accessing past recordings, just message me if you're not sure about that. If you're on the Teams call, of course, you should see my j.bustard is my way of contacting me. If you're in the room, my business card is there. You can take it. Okay, another question then. Just to get a vibe, you guys are happy enough with this format, right? Me going through the questions. That's just as fun as me giving a big somewhat coherent speech. Okay, it's all the same material. Okay, so could you talk a bit about agentic AI? I keep seeing this online, but it would be good to learn a bit more. Okay, so yes, so we had ChatGPT that came out, very earth-shattering. Everybody's interacting with it. And then what happened quite quickly was people who had expertise in AI, some of them, like Andrew Ng, for example, is very, very influential, very capable AI person. He had this company that was all about making AI. You know, he was like one of the leaders incredibly commercializing AI. And most of his work was the type that I was talking about, where you're using computer vision to detect faults in a factory line or something like that. And then ChatGPT came out, and obviously it represented a type of AI technology that wasn't well aligned with his skill set. And so a lot of people kind of like went, it's not as good as you think it is. Like it's a gimmick sort of thing. They sort of reacted in a negative way because their expertise wasn't well aligned with the problem area. But what you saw very quickly, like it took Andrew Ng like 2 months, maybe, in my opinion, to go from like defensive and negative to being giving a speech at Sequoia. So Sequoia Capital is one of the VC firms in Silicon Valley that funds a lot of these things. And they have a very interesting series of YouTube videos. You can check them out. And every year they get the great and the good of the AI world to talk. And Andrew Ng was like invited, and he gave this talk on agentic AI. And effectively, this is a general strategy. If you want to be on top of everything, what you basically do is you see the revolution and you try to predict where it's going, and then you guess what skills and things will be necessary for that position. And then you start talking about that, not the thing that's currently working. Because the thing that's currently working is usually a big load of graft to understand and get good at. And you've got the long tail of like tricky, thick problems. And so agentic AI was kind of like, okay, we believe that OpenAI and the foundation companies will make these general large language models. And even though they're unreliable at the moment, they will eventually be reliable. They will be like human beings. So what we should do is anticipate that that becomes the case, and we should start writing computer programs that effectively organize AIs just the way human organizations organize people to achieve a task. And so they would write a computer program, and a lot of the agentic stuff initially was literally mirroring human organizations. So somebody would do something like, they'd say, here is a tech company that makes contract, CRUD web apps for a business. That company is made of a marketing department and a programmer and a UI designer and stuff like this. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to take instances of ChatGPT. I'm going to tell them at the top that they're a UI designer or whatever they are, and get them to communicate with each other as if they were human beings to perform this larger task. And loads of venture capital money was just poured in that direction for like a year. And what happened was most of the systems failed completely. And the reason they failed completely was because it's a little bit like I was talking about with the Connect. The LLM was unreliable. Humans in a group are less reliable often than a single individual. So by getting them to talk together, and they individually were unreliable, the collective organization was more unreliable, and things would fall apart very quickly. I talked in previous lectures about how Claude Sonnet 4 for me was a revolution, and the revolution that it represented was I could now have this task, and I could incrementally perform the task with steps with an AI, and the AI would fix more problems than it caused. So if you gave it enough time, the feeling was that gradually the thing would improve. But up until that level, which has only been around for about 3 months now, there was no point in getting AIs to do more than one step, mostly. Because after a few steps, it would fail, and then it would continue to fail. And so it would just, everything would fall apart, right? There was no way for it to just do more effort and make things better, right? So agentic AI, which is still what a bunch of people are trying to sell, trying to make and do things like that, shifted a bit. At the same time that this was happening, Y Combinator, who was also talking about agentic AI, I talk about Y Combinator quite a bit. It's, again, the sort of heart of Silicon Valley startup world. They started talking about businesses that had made a lot of money with AI, and they worked differently. So the big one that happened early was automating low-level kind of clerical legal work. And they actually had existed prior to foundation models existing. So what they had done originally was they didn't know LLMs were a thing. They were like, this task is repetitive enough that pre-ChatGPT level technology might be able to solve this task. And then when ChatGPT came around, they just seamlessly integrated it, and it did better. But the task was quite well defined. It was more akin to like searching for things, and they were doing things with like search engine style AI technology before they were using the AIs. And the thing that made their work different was, instead of pretending the AIs were human and getting them to talk to each other, what they did was they gathered a huge amount of data about how the task was done in real life, and they broke the task into lots of smaller sub activities. They sort of like created a taxonomy of what it meant to do the task. And then for each of these tasks, they gathered lots of data about real examples of success and failure. So they created a very scientific way of measuring whether their AI was doing the right thing. And what they focused on instead of pretending they're humans and talking to each other was they focused very carefully on the English that they were using to prompt the AI with, but any other factor they could control. So they tried fine-tuning the models for specific tasks. They tried different things. And the way their business operates is that they can swap in new AIs whenever they come out. And then they have this very scientific way of measuring whether or not that AI is better at any given specific task. So this really long tail of problems, they can really scientifically measure whether it is achieving those tasks. So yeah, so that is also called agentic AI, and that is the way to make money in the field of agentic AI, which is by measuring your success, having a well-focused task that isn't too open-ended. You're basically formalizing it in a very detailed way. So those companies started to be pointed to and say, like, these people know what they're doing, and this is the way to make AI. And people started talking about, like, Palantir was a big example. So Palantir have been selling AI-like capabilities for ages. Palantir is really, to some extent, a contract software company that happens to have a bunch of libraries that make it a little bit easy to do certain kinds of statistical analysis and access to clever data sets and private data sets and stuff. So what they do is they have what they call forward deployed engineers, where, you know, if anyone shows an interest in them, they'll basically send a clever programmer to sit with the potential customer, monitor what they do all day, identify specific parts of their job that they think they can automate or enhance, and then they create a specific AI for that task. What they're not doing is selling artificial humans that do general artificial work. And in general, everyone that's made a lot of money has been very specific about what they're doing. What's interesting about that is that's the general recipe for entrepreneurship anyway. If you want to be a good business, you typically have a really clear understanding of what your customers want. You don't solve all their problems. You solve a set of those problems that you can reliably, repeatedly do for a profit. And that's what you do. And then they have to go to somebody else if they want something non-standard. So actually, it's not really different from the way we normally do things. But if you search for agentic AI, you will get a wide range of these different things, some of which are very useful and many of which are just playing, basically. And so you have to be very careful about where you're getting your advice from when you're thinking of doing that. The investment I was talking about in automating an AI IDE, we're basically trying to follow that process that I described that the legal firm did, where we're sort of formalizing all the tasks you would do, trying to automate some of them. That's the direction that we're probably going to go in. And I do think that that is the future. I'm very skeptical of the, like, treat everything like a human, which is extremely expensive to run, by the way, to do it that way. Okay. Okay. My next question, almost to the end of the questions. What do you think about AI generated works being copyrighted or patented under a robot's name? um, I think that that is a marketing tool. I don't think that that has anything particularly economically real going on. What would that mean? That's kind of like the Roman Empire allowing one of their slaves to have, like, some exclusive right over manufacturing something. It doesn't mean anything because they're completely owned by someone else, and they always will be, and they will have no agency and freedom to do anything else. So what is a very interesting question, but a long way away, and we are culturally massively far away from being able to do this, is the idea that at some point we might merge with AIs, or we might be uploaded into computers and run in a simulated way. And if that were to happen, we would need to establish all these legal precedents so that when people were uploaded, we had rights, basically. I think the chances are of, like, there's way more chance of, like, cows getting rights than a robot, to me. That seems more likely. But who knows? Who knows? But I think that's likely to be the case. I'm not a big fan of copyrights and patents. When I was in games, obviously that was my business. And as soon as one of the first game I ever made, we had a pirated version of that available within a few weeks of it launching. Not only was it available, but the people who had pirated it had understood the code enough. They'd reverse engineered a compiled console game on a custom disk. It was crazy. And they'd compressed the textures. And so they could run the game with like less memory being used. So they could inject their own code into the program and provide additional like functionality. And our game was not like a massive hit or anything. So I saw that world, and I actually knew some people who are partially in the world of piracy. And they did low key things like one of them cracked DVD players, so they were a region unlocked. Another person just provided translations for films, and so I had awareness of the world of piracy while I was in games. And generally, most people didn't care very much. The only people who seemed to care were sort of like predatory, like business people. They weren't people who were making stuff. I never cared. One of the reasons I never cared was I never knew of a situation in which somebody had a hit game that was a hit because everyone was copying it and they weren't rich. So as far as I was concerned, if you make a hit, you become rich. The fact that all these teenagers or whatever are playing your game without paying you, it's not clear that that's not necessarily helping you, right? Because if half of the economy is telling people about what you've made, and a certain percentage of the population is always going to pay for something, if people who are probably not going to pay for it anyway steal it, it's kind of like free advertising. So that was the way that I generally viewed patents and copyrights. There's obviously situations where that's not necessarily the case. Also for patents, when I was at Southampton, I did a lot of things involving entrepreneurship, or a lot of training involving entrepreneurship. And one of the things that came up, where they were talking about patents, and we were constantly being told about patents, always from law firms, that you would pay to patent things. And then I started asking questions about this. It was like the university at Southampton had invented a lot of important things. One of the things they'd invented was fiber optic cable, for example. It also patented a small submarine, and that was the cause of one of the stories. So the fiber optic cable thing, they made a like no more than £100,000 from that, right? Because effectively, like overcoming patents is such a reliable thing. The submarine was more jarring. They had designed the submarine, they had patented it, and then an American company had literally copied the submarine and started selling it in the most flagrant violation of the patents. So the university decided that they were going to sue the American company, but they simply couldn't afford to do it. And nothing happened, and the company just continued doing what it was doing. When I was in games, before the first game was launched, we pitched the game to a number of different companies, including Infogrames. I have to be a little bit careful about this, I suppose. But I think it was Infogrames, so don't sue me, Infogrames, for this. I know you don't call yourself Infogrames anymore. You call yourselves Atari. I don't find that a very convincing rebrand. But anyway, and so what they did was they took all our material, our like screenshots, and then they just went away and made a game, obviously just handing over the art assets to their team, and they made this game, and they put like a Warner Brothers license on it. So they had like Donald Duck and stuff playing in the game. Now, the final version of our game, we obviously changed the art. Typically, you would change the art over the course of a project. It's extremely rare that you would make a game that was an exact copy of your concept art at the beginning of the game. But they did flagrantly, totally violation. You know, things were signed, NDAs. They didn't care. Massive company, small company, doesn't matter. So in my experience, mostly copyrights and patents don't serve the people that they are branded to serve. And I only know of stories where it didn't help. So that's why I'm very skeptical about those things. How do we get involved with QLabs? Is a high level of coding skill required? Um, Most QLabbers are quite comfortable programming. I have in previous years tried doing projects with people who aren't so experienced programming, and generally the entire project ends up that person learning how to program. So I typically don't do projects with that. You don't have to be like a world-class programmer, but you have to be comfortable programming. And I suppose I can try to explain that at some time if somebody wants me to. The way you join QLab is you just message me and then you have a meeting with me. I have a lot of projects on, so it is a little tricky to fit them in, and you might have to experience like a doctor's surgery where you turn up and you wait while other people talk to me and then I talk to you, and that's just the reality of having so many projects on. Um, what do I think about Palantir's large ties to government bodies, gathering data on the population, and possible reducing privacy? One of the things that's always really surprised me about this is that I don't know of occasions where it's been applied. I feel like I would hear more stories somehow about how all that surveillance was being used. All the Snowden stuff, basically America recording like every phone conversation, GCHQ having compromised every internet service provider, all these kinds of things. They're obviously gathering unfathomable quantities of information on things. And, one thing that was interesting was like spy satellites got incredibly good, and you go like, oh, well, could somebody launch the Starlink equivalent of spy satellites and completely cover the globe with like high resolution surveillance? I remember my supervisor back in 2000 saying, don't look up because they'll recognize your face. That was the level at way back in those days. So, I always think about these things and I go like, but empirically, I never see it actually happening. So the way I handle risk, same way I feel about patents and copyright and everything like that, is like, what do I know? I always use this crude measurement, which is like there's a thing called the Dunbar number, and that is effectively the natural number of relationships that you can manage in your head is about 100. I think that includes fictional people. So the actual number of people is less than 100, and you kind of know their life and you have some kind of psychological relationship with them. So when I think of like, do I know anyone that this has ever happened to? When I ask people about things, have they ever heard of anything that has ever happened to anyone? When I think about all the social media and all the news I've ever read, have I ever heard about it? So theoretically, GCHQ and these other spy agencies, they could be super competent using their incredible surveillance to clamp down on any leaks about any time they ever use their surveillance. But a lot of the time, you're like, what are you doing? Like, you're not even like, I don't see any great like economic wins or like all the reasons that you would do this to surveil everybody to kind of track things down. I don't know. It's just been my impression. I've been a little bit involved in occasionally security related projects, and I typically ask people about like how do people actually do stuff. So for example, I was at a law conference and they had a guest person in and they specialized in effectively this, right? Like legal action and investigations around the legality of automated surveillance for very serious criminal cases, right? So these are absolutely the circumstances in which all this surveillance would be useful. So we're talking serious organized crime, horrific like human trafficking, this kind of stuff. Nobody like cares about the privacy of human traffickers, right? Like obviously. So and then I was asking them like, what indication have you had that this new surveillance is being used? And he was saying that like there is a massive gap between the people who are paid to investigate that stuff, who have actual responsibility, they actually prosecute people, arrest people, all of those people doing the work, policemen and whatever the grander version of a policeman is, and the people who are gathering the technology and providing the technology. So what they were saying was almost all major drug busts, almost all human trafficking busts, almost all of that comes from a human being telling them it's happening. The major organized criminal families, they know who they are, right? They know who they are. They don't need to bug their phones because like they're probably already trying to do that. And you know, whatever means they have of bypassing that surveillance is effective. But all this other stuff is being given to them, but they're like, we didn't ask for this. Do you know what I mean? The dominant message that I was getting was that they were saying, like, we would really love it if you could take a fraction of the money that you are spending on this technology infrastructure and give us for more overtime. If we could have a couple more police officers who are basically sitting outside someone's house, that would be massively more useful than like every phone call in the world being recorded on a database we can search, right? That was absolutely the impression. That was about 2 years ago that I was getting that impression. Now, obviously, you can believe that the world has some secret cabal of super competent people that use the technology really well. Palantir obviously sell that as they say, like, we're really good at that. I have a project on at the moment, which is about data scraping, data analysis. And what we were doing is basically trying to create a system for you can query something. In this particular case, it was companies, but it could be anything you want to query. And then we're sort of chaining together some state-of-the-art AIs to take information, you know, search the web, scrape stuff, pass that through an AI and turn it into some kind of like knowledge graph database with lots of facts in it that we could intelligently search and process, right? So, but we're piecing together the modern things. And the person I'm working with is actually at YouTube. And this person's job, part of their job, is to analyze businesses. And I'm not sure exactly why, but that's something they do. And they have this extremely expensive commercial product, which is very similar to like the Palantir technology, which is intended to give them precise profiling information about companies. And what they were telling me was Gemini Deep Research is like 10 times more accurate, right? The very first company they tried, it didn't work. Gemini got it right. So basically, the vibes are that current AI is superior consumer level at like doing a lot of profiling and finding information out than any of these super expensive things. So obviously, OpenAI and various companies are trying to sell that, trying to convince Trump that they're aligned with Trump's ideology and do things like that so that they'll get legal exemptions and all kinds of stuff. So and so they're basically saying, sure, we'll use our super AI to make this better. But like I say, I think there's all of these like practical human barriers in all these circumstances, very similar to the S curves that I was talking about. Will it one day become mass surveillance? The thing I'm more worried about is I never used to worry about targeted advertising. How am I doing for time? Never used to worry about targeted advertising. It was always laughably awful. And then I started using ChatGPT. I started using the memory feature in ChatGPT, and I felt that it was getting a really good sense of me and my values and what I was interested in. And it's the first time I've ever interacted with a technology which was like, I'm pretty sure you could convince me to buy something. I mean, I buy all kinds of stupid crap, so it's not too hard to convince me to buy things, but like it could manipulate me effectively in a way that nothing else could. So that's going to, I feel, because of the economic benefits of improved advertising and the economic importance, we're going to start to see privacy. That's going to be the thin end of the wedge. That technology is going to be like 10 years ahead of the security services. And maybe I'm wrong. Like, obviously, I've never actually worked for them. I've never seen behind the curtain. I don't know if they're super competent. I did early on do biometrics research early in my career, and I did talk to people who were like in the military and did military research stuff. And I was sort of saying to them, and in fact, a billionaire who was like the second, well, equal, if not most successful biometrics person in the whole world. And he'd recently sold his company and become a billionaire. But and I was sort of saying to him, as like I've always got the impression, from the Bond films that like there's all this super technology that is superior to like research level work, publicly available research work. And he was like, nah, no, not at all. But basically there isn't all this secret stuff. The place where it might be is in Ukraine, possibly Gaza, but probably Ukraine, where I think you're seeing like feedback. I'm a massive believer in feedback. And there are a few things that are more important in terms of feedback than stopping people dying or killing other people. So you get really clear feedback whether something's working or not. And that is not as common as you would imagine in other walks of life. So I think there is rapid iteration and improvement in that area, but most of it seems to be autonomous weapons, drones, surveillance, that kind of stuff. So yeah, that's what I think about that. Um, yeah, highly sensitive data for AI purposes. Yeah, I mean, we are creating risks. Incredibly personal information is being constantly shared with the AI in a way that other platforms wouldn't. Like, okay, you could maybe look at someone's porn search history, and that's pretty sensitive. But actually, the way in which people are interacting with chatbots these days, it's not just like deeply embarrassing or slightly scandalous. It's a true insight into their psychology, their dreams. Absolutely everything about them is being kind of shared. I do that mildly. I tend not to get therapy from AIs, but there are plenty of people who are. So that is like probably way more information than even like a therapist would have or a doctor would have or anything like that. It's it represents hours and hours of interactions and like feedback and interactivity that you wouldn't get in other places. So yeah, that's new. We don't really know. But then I would fall back on this my usual thing, which is like although people have killed themselves and there are some highly profile cases, you would expect a certain number of people to die anyway. So it's hard to tell that it's any more severe than it would be normally. So I haven't seen any statistics or events that would indicate to me that this is actually a problem yet. Okay, cool. So I spent the entire time answering questions. I hope that was useful. I will very briefly get any questions from anybody in the room, if anybody feels like asking a question. No, everybody's good. So yeah, I didn't cover what I said I was going to cover, which I can talk about next week, unless you would rather me continue answering questions, in which case give me loads of questions and I'll keep answering questions. All right. Okay. I hope that was interesting, entertaining.